and welcome to the Make It Work podcast. I'm your host, Kluane Saunders. In this podcast, we are talking to practitioners who are making their own work in the UK right now. So join us, learn with us, and let's make it work.
Where's your anger? And I'd be like, oh God, okay, so that's the bit that is your fuel. And I think it's harder now. Like, I really think it's much more difficult for people to kind of get work on. I wanted to make theatre for people who didn't like theatre. And part of my kind of thing with not philosophy, it was like a lack of knowing, was I thought if I just make them really tired, they'll be brilliant. You can work with one actor, or you can work with 100. All you need to think about is like how wide that shot is. I think it's the messiness of life. You know, there's something about movement that allows the messiness to be like kind of front and center, and I find that's really thrilling. So suddenly I had this, like, the world's greatest playwright and us having this really intense, beautiful dialogue about like what art can mean and how you can protest and how you can think about your place in the world. And then I suddenly started to go like, I should be talking to the industry, because every act of creation I think is a miracle.
My guest today is Shane Dempsey. Shane trained at the National Theatre Studio and East 15 Acting School. He has worked for the National Theatre as movement director for Hamlet, as staff director for Translations, and as mentor director for Connections. His other productions include Shining City at Theatre Royal Stratford East, My Future at the Donmar Warehouse, Continuity and the non-stop Connolly Show at the Finborough, About Last Night, and 7 Jewish Children at the Arcola. He is also the founding member of Fragments, a dynamic physical ensemble in London working across theatre and film. Shane is an experienced facilitator and regularly works with the National Theatre Learning Department. Shane ran Stagecraft, one of Ireland's leading youth theatres, from 1998 to 2016. Hello, Shane. Welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, I am great, actually. I mean, the sun is nearly shining.
Almost shining.
Yeah, nearly shining.
There.
There's going to be
there.
rain at 3 and 6.
Yeah, welcome to London. It's the London experience.
Well, it's the thing is, whenever I don't have overseas guests, the weather seems to be
absolutely
gorgeous.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And yesterday, my mother-in-law and her boyfriend and some extended family got caught in the massive downpour.
That little shower there.
Yes, that little one that lasted all night. So lucky me.
It is. You just got to roll with it. It's part of the London experience.
How long have you been in London?
Oh, goodness. I think 2006, 2007 is when I came to train as a director.
Long time.
So yeah, it is a long time.
Yeah.
And you start to count, you're like, oh God, that's closer to like decades rather than years.
So you came to train.
I came to train at East 15.
Mm-hmm. And you did the directing course.
The directing course, yeah. And I madly got funded before I had a place. This is the glorious days of the Celtic Tiger, which like basically is like there was a lot of money in Ireland. Okay. And I applied for funding to the Arts Council and they were like, yeah, sure. And I was like, okay, I have to find a course.
Yeah.
And I applied to a couple of different courses and like interviewed, and then I went to East 15 and I kind of fell in love. Mm-hmm. It was like this beautiful campus and it was outside and there was this kind of really kind of rigorous but playful spirit to the place. And I was like, okay, I think this is it. And I had an amazing time. Like, it was an absolutely brilliant time. And the head of the course was a man called Brian Astbury, who kind of then became one of my best friends and founded the first interracial theatre in the world in South Africa.
Oh, great.
Called The Space, which kind of championed the work of Athol Fugart. And he was this kind of master of do it yourself and make it work. So kind of I was exposed to this very different way of thinking, because up to that point I kind of thought, I knew what a play was. Do you know what I mean? And then he would go, yeah, but what are you passionate about? Where's your anger? And I'd be like, oh God, okay. He said, that's the bit that is your fuel. So it was kind of like, he was an amazing man. He sadly is no longer with us. But yeah, he was an incredible like force of nature. Also kind of trained Rufus Norris, gave Rufus Norris his first gig as a director, because he said, you need to be on charge. So yeah, his legacy is kind of extraordinary, really.
Yeah. Tell me more about Find Your Anger.
Yeah, what was that about? Because I suppose he came from such a kind of volatile political situation. And he was like, that's the fuel. That's the thing that drives you. And at the time, I was pretty angry, to be honest. Not necessarily, I didn't know what it was about. Do you know what I mean? I had this huge kind of, I still do, like at my best, have a sense of like justice and equality. And he was like, that's where your work is. And I didn't fully understand it at the time until I started to kind of like, then you look back at maybe a 10-year period and you go, actually, there is a link in all those, the work that you do and the projects that you do.
Yeah.
So one of the projects I did at East 15, which was completely bonkers, because I was working with 3 actors from the MA course, and they were like, oh, we want to do something on the 3 Sisters. And I was like, oh, I really don't want to do the 3 Sisters. I was like it's fine. Like, it's a great play. But I was like, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
But I was like, so what's the equivalent now? And I was like, what about like, and I don't know who came up with the idea. I think it was one of them that actually said, what about like the idea of the Russian bride? So we were like trying to get out of Moscow as opposed to going to Moscow. Yeah. So we went, like 4 of us went to Moscow for this kind of intensive rehearsal period of research.
Wow.
I know, it was again, I said a little bit bonkers, because that is run by like, at least then was run by pretty hardcore people. So I had to sign something at East 15 saying that, you know, if you're arrested, it's your problem. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll sign it. So we went off to Moscow, and we spent, 3 weeks kind of devising on location, working in character, and trying to make this show, which was about the kind of experience of people coming to the West. Yeah. So that was kind of, gives you a little flavour of the kind of work I was doing at East 15. Yeah. And that was, and I was still training at that point.
Wow. And were you working, because now you are a movement director?
Yeah, officially.
Working at the National, doing some...
I've been in some nice places.
Amazing projects, the Donmar Warehouse, just to name a few of the places. Yeah. But were you working physically at that point?
Yeah, at that point I was. Yeah. I didn't know I was.
Okay.
Like, that show, Skulka, was very physical. Mm-hmm. Like, it started off with the 3 actors in a box, this huge white box, and they the music kicked in, and it was all this kind of contemporary Russian music, because it was devised in Russia. So we just created playlists, and it was made over 7 weeks rehearsal, and we did like 40 hours a week.
Great.
I know, yeah, only when you're in school. You can spend that long like making something. And I think we had 37 minutes of material at the end of it. And then I was like, okay, I think that's good. So it was a very, very inspired by that kind of Grotowskian way of working, very playful, very wild. And it was all about these 3 women that were stuck in this room waiting to board a plane. And they kind of went into flashbacks of their past. And it did like incredibly well. It's a long time ago. Went to Edinburgh, went to Belgium, went to Ireland. Kind of had this long life.
It developed from the 37 minutes into
a writer was brought in and kind of reworked it. And Brian always said, like, I think you made it worse by bringing in a writer. And I was like, okay, maybe. But it was much more refined. He loved the kind of anarchy of it, which was kind of part of its spirit. But he was like, the need for structure. And I was like, well, I think I need to lock it down. And he was like, maybe. So he kind of was, he was an extraordinary kind of rock in my life. And like all through that. And then after, I suppose during that time at East 15, I was very much like, I'm just going to make my own work, and was kind of ignoring the industry. Didn't want to talk to it, didn't care, was very kind of had this rebellious spirit. And then when I finished East 15, I ran, again, this was a kind of how random life can be. I met this German guy, David, who was planning on running this festival in northwest London in Mill Hill. And he was like, can I run it with you, Shane? And I was like, yeah, of course you can. We can run a festival, but we're like, where's the money? And he was like, oh no, we haven't got any yet, but we've got this building. And I was like, okay. And I was kind of cautious about like what this building could be. So I ended up living in this building with, I suppose now would be the equivalent of like a commune.
Yeah.
So everyone had we took over this building, which had 80 rehearsal rooms, was run by this Irish developer, which and ended up, his son was a filmmaker. And suddenly I was like, okay, this is my tribe. So that started the next adventure, which lasted 7 years.
Fragments.
Yes. Which was an international ensemble.
Yeah.
which had the incredible idea of like being international, even though we weren't international. We were just like a bunch of misfits, really, which was kind of the joy of it.
How did you audition an ensemble? Did you just
No, I
meet
met all these people at East 15 that were extraordinary and were waiting for something to happen. And I was kind of like, look, we might as well just make something happen. And that became the kind of like the driving force. And like it was a series of accidents because I had this idea of running an ensemble because I kind of was obsessed with like German work and like the idea of international, how you go across borders to create work, even though I kind of hadn't done it. I was like, this was like...
Yeah, you went to Russia.
Yeah, I went to Russia. So I kind of, I had a little flavour of it,
Yeah.
but I didn't know how I would do that. But then I met Tom and Hannah, who's a playwright, and the three of us kind of said, okay, what if we did like big scale theatre work as well as film and TV? Which was like, okay, great, ambitious.
Yeah.
And we had all this space and I knew all these actors and they were kind of waiting for something to happen. And I was like, okay, let's just do it. And then we'll figure it out. And Brian was there as this kind of force of nature saying, now you have this space, you have no excuse. So I did a show called The Bay, again, which had an incredible life. And I devised it at East 15 with the actors and stage combat people who were this kind of radical physical course. And I made this story, which was inspired by a true story that happened like very close to my hometown, where there was this murder in this New Age traveller camp. And my dad happened to be there at the time. So I knew all the characters. And I kind of pitched it to them. I said, like, I've got this idea. I said, I don't know if it's going to be like what it would be, but I think this is the feel of it. So we devised it again. And then that became Fragments' first kind of major production. And it was very wild. Like it was like, and that went to Edinburgh, but we kind of hijacked the festival. Again, I think you've got to think about the idea of an anarchist because that's what, philosophically, that's what we were.
Right.
We were like, okay, we'll go to Edinburgh, but we won't go into the brochure. We won't go to a venue. We'll find a venue.
Wow.
We'll like sofa surf. I'll stay with my grand aunt. We'll like get buses. It was because there was no money. We didn't really have any cash, which was kind of part of the problem with Fragments. The ideas, but not necessarily the resources always.
Yeah.
Which is usually better.
Yes. Yes. You mentioned you did eventually get funding, Arts Council funding with Fragments.
Well, there's a couple that we were very successful with. One was Mothers of Modern Ireland, which was a documentary that we basically had this kind of really ambitious idea. I was filming my grandmother. Tom was filming his grandmother and Hannah was filming her grandmother, like independently. Because I was like, there's this generation of women in Ireland that have been kind of quietly ignored. And what happens when they're gone? Like, how do we remember?
Yeah.
So we started this idea and we made this trailer, which was like basically our three grandmothers and us with this really low res quality of us kind of like engaging with them. And then we went to a county council in Ireland and said, look, to do this properly, we need to go across the whole of Ireland, 32 counties. And they were like, okay, we love it. Let's apply for the money. So that was where we went. That's where your ambition, if I was to do it now, I would be saying, okay, this is going to cost an awful lot of money. But we basically had enough to get us there to rent the equipment. And we were doing it in this ad hoc way. We'd call up hotels 3 days in advance. We'd get on local media. Like this was like, but we didn't turn up with, a van. We turned up in a car with a suitcase of one camera. And it was and therefore it was really accessible for the women to talk to us because we didn't have any of the things that would terrify somebody. So we met 32 women over the age of 65 and engaged with them in this kind of deep conversation about their lives and what it is to be like a woman in Ireland through historic change. And we didn't really know, after about a week, we were like, this is not a documentary. We knew that there wasn't a through line with the women's stories that would actually coherently like make sense. So we were like, it's an archive, that's it. Which became like this beautiful thing. Ended up in the New York Irish Centre, like as like an online thing.
Wow.
Ended up kind of having this beautiful life. Loads of people still engage with it. And I suppose it just sits there as this kind of resource historically.
sounds like you're very driven by making something.
Yeah.
And you don't
always.
necessarily need to know exactly what it is when you start
No,
out.
no. I do a lot of thinking about it, and I'm really rigorous about like the investigation of it. But I'm confident enough to know that I'll be able to make it. Do you know what I mean? And I can go, actually, no, that's not what I need. That needs, and I become totally obsessed with something. But yeah, I suppose it's that thing of not allowing the kind of financial restraints, or if you can find a way through to find a little avenue. Because all the work with Fragments was done in like non-theatre spaces, and like where we worked in Edinburgh was the place called the Big Red Door, which I think is gone.
I don't think I've been.
Definitely gone.
Yeah.
It's like, but it was run by these kind of radical artists from all over the world that kind of took over this mill, and we were like, oh yeah, this is our tribe. We'll slot in there.
Yeah.
And I think it's harder now. Like, I really think it's much more difficult for people to kind of get work on than it was when I was starting to do those kind of really wild shows that you would need now. Like $250,000 would be kind of what you'd need to have 15 performers and sound designers. And we just did it because we were like, we had to.
Yeah. And so what were you a collective, as in was anyone sort of getting paid for these projects, or was it like
mostly
everyone
not.
put
Mostly not. And that's how it kind of became like impossible near the end, because we had a producer then, Anna Dudina, who's extraordinary, and we kind of did this really intensive fundraising. That's like the last phase was like, we've got to get the money. But it's to do with when it happens, you know, because we had hit numerous financial crashes. Do you know what I mean? And it was like, we remember doing this massive application. They were like, who are your competitors? And we were like, well, Complicity and Frantic. I was like, okay, wow. We've got a long way to go, actually, because this is the kind of work we're making. But these are our competitors who are like, Complicity are 40 years old and Frantic are whatever, close to that as well. So I was like, this is where we're kind of trying to slot into. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is there's so much about that is about luck, that is beyond your control in terms of the economic world, how much is being invested in the arts. And I think part of the kind of the end of the Fragments experiment was that we were getting further from the thing that we loved, which was making. And we were like, now we're spending weeks filling in application forms. But, you know, we had some successes as well.
And now you work as a movement director. You've worked with the National on Hamlet most recently. In those situations, you've got a director on board.
Yeah, of course, it's beautiful.
And you're coming into a process.
Yeah.
How do you change your approach to maybe build a physical language in an existing production?
I think you always start by going like, what do you need from me? And what I love about movement work is I don't have to solve all the problems. I don't always have to, you know, I'll come in, there's already a team involved, there's already a designer on board. So I'm already going, okay, so this is the physical world. What are the things that you need from me in terms of how does that work? What are the things you really are excited by? So when I worked on Hamlet with Ellie, which was a revival for a massive schools tour, I think it was 8,000 children saw it in the end. And it was like, and then they did a 3-week run in the Dorfman, but it had toured all over the country. So I sat with Ellie and we were just like, I was like, what are the things that you love? And she was like, oh, okay, I love transitions that kind of make me really excited. So I just had this list of like things I love. And then she was like, and then, there's the puppets. And I was like, okay, so tell me more about the puppets. I was like, great. I clearly had like misread that part of the script because I was like, okay, puppetry. Yeah, lovely. Okay. So thinking about breath. And I was thinking about like, what are the wow moments? Because it was an hour long. And the audience were like 9 to 12, I think. And it was a remount. So there was already a world. And she was like, okay, what happened before was very much like this. And what we'd love to do now is this. So you're basically just having that chat going, what are the things that excite you? And then I'm going, okay, so what I'd love to do is this. I don't really want to do choreography. And she was like, okay, either do I. Brilliant. I was like, okay, cool. We're going to be okay. Because I think there is a kind of, they're connected, those two worlds, but they're not the same. So when I'm working with movement, I'm looking at like, how do I work with this actor's particular like speciality and like personality, and how do I transfer that into a bigger space? And how do I look at that, like playing with scale? Well, a choreographer will think about, this is what I needed to do. Can you go 5, 6, 7, 8. And I was like, I'm not going to count it. I need you to feel it. So it like tied back to like some of the imagery was very much Fragments based, weirdly, with a lot more money now. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's just, but it's a similar kind of way of working that is much more expressive and much more like looking at how do you create beauty and images that really reach you. And I was like, what's wonderful about like that particular production is like the children will tell you when they're bored, because they will literally start talking. And what we were trying to constantly do was going, how do we get enough wow moments so that they are constantly like at the edge of their seat and like hooked. But it all comes down to just like having really open conversations about what is it you love, and then going, how do I kind of facilitate that? And sometimes it is about going, we need to move the table. Like, do you know what I mean? It's really boring. It's not like, it's not exciting. Like in that particular one, there was this really painful transition that they were just about to go into the big fight sequence, and we had like 4 pallets. And I was like, this is a nightmare, because basically it's going to take time. And how do we, at this point in the story, the audience are really engaged, like there's going to be a fight. And how do we make this feel like it's part of the story as opposed to being like practical? So we did this kind of slightly ritualistic building of the pallets, which is still one of my favorite moments in the whole piece, where they came out as these kind of like, almost like they were kind of like Zen masters and beautifully laid them out. And then suddenly arrived with a sword, and then you were like, oh, okay, it's happening. And I go, okay, that's beautiful, because it's simplistic and you're really using the practical thing of, I need to get the pallets on, we need to set up the fight, but it's going to take time because there's only 8 actors. We can't necessarily just go, let's throw this really quickly at it. And it's problem solving. You kind of go, okay, great, I can just technically work that out. But yeah, it always starts with that conversation of going, what do you need? Another show I did last year, but again, its scale was absolutely insane, with Jack Reardon, who was the artistic director of Stagecraft, had an ensemble of 80. And I was brought in as the movement director, and that was outside a new play that he and Anya Ryan had written together, which was 3 generations of soldiers in a barracks.
Wow.
And there was I was working with an ensemble of 80 people, and you're kind of going, okay, so what do you need? And he was like, okay, so we need to create these moments that they're going to sing, and they need to travel from here to here. And I would literally work out flight paths.
Yeah.
And like draw them, and then go, how do I work with somebody? Like there was one person, I think he was in his 80s.
Wow.
He was the eldest.
Yeah.
And there was another lady who had like a lot of mobility issues. So you're constantly going, okay, so how do I do that? And then there's 14-year-olds who are like, I can do backflips, Shane. And I was like, okay, cool. So how do we work those in and make this space really like shared and allow them to lead the ideas, but also go, like, practically, how do I get 80 people to listen to me? So I had all these hand signals. I'd put my hand in the air and they'd copy me. And it was kind of like the scale of it was absolutely enormous. So after that, I kind of felt, yeah, this is something you can, like, you can work with 1 actor, or you can work with 100. All you need to think about is like how wide that shot is, and how do I make sure that people are like, where are they looking, and how do I suspend that tension with 80 people? And it was kind of like really beautifully inspiring, because you were like, wow, this is kind of like, my frame of reference was the Olympics. I was like, okay, oh my God, how did they do that? I was like, well, then they had earpieces, they had a click track. I was like, okay, we don't have that. So how do we like work backwards and go, how do we do our version of that, which is a kind of more acoustic version? But yeah, it's fun.
It made me also think about how do you work with actors who maybe didn't train in a physical way? They're used to being a talking head, and they're uncomfortable physicalizing.
I suppose you just think about, what is it that they kind of can do, and go, how do I go? Like for Hamlet, it was very different, because I was involved in the casting process. I was at every round of the auditions. We did a big workshop that was 3 hours long. So we were able to go, the kind of storytelling we need to tell, we need people that are really up for this way of working. And I suppose often if you bring in a movement director, you already have made decisions about the kind of language around it. But if you are working with somebody or if it's a play that is, I worked with Nadia Fall as an assistant director on Shining City at Stratford East. And Jack Murphy, who is Bridgerton, is renowned for the choreography of Bridgerton. He was like, like, where's the movement language in this? Like, I'm the movementer. She's like, it's not about movement, it's about gesture. And I was like, oh my God, that's exact. Because basically this is like, it's a counselling session.
Okay.
You know, it's a Conor McPherson play. It's very dense. There's a whole lot of stuff about ghosts and the backstory and the nuance of the complexity of the human being. But Jack was like, where's the movement? Because there isn't any transitions. They're in a room, and it was about gesture. And I was like, oh, that's ingenious. Because actually that's what you're thinking about. You're going, what is the behavior of these people? And even if they are thinking about, this is my frame, what is it about the nuance of the inner life? So you're going, okay, so it's a close-up, great. So all they've got then is like, they've literally just got the upper body. How do you distill that emotional feeling into the kind of nuance of the, like, that little moment in time? And you're going, right, okay, that's all it needs. And it's about the breath. And you go, and you gradually can unlock it. But sometimes it doesn't need a lot. Sometimes it needs to be, how are they just in the space together? But you're trying to think about the visual storytelling. That's the job a lot of the time, is going, how does it actually, what does the audience see as well as just what they hear, which is kind of sometimes difficult.
That's, yeah. I mean, I think you do sometimes see those productions where, you know, you see these tiny little things.
Yeah.
But they like pull you in. And film, I'm interested because you worked with Fragments, you worked on film as well.
Yeah.
And I guess we don't think hugely about movement direction
No.
in film.
Like there's some. Do you know what I mean? Like now it's become do you know what I mean? Saltburn and like Polly Bennett did like all the what was the Queen film? Was it like
Bohemian Rhapsody?
Oh, that was movement direction.
Yeah.
And Polly talked about, like, you know, they had these kind of like things about spaghetti for like some of the gestures of Freddie Mercury. I was like, that's incredible, because you're making it task based. But I suppose, it depends entirely on what it is, what the world of it is. And I think with TV and film now, there is kind of stuff that's been made that's much more heightened. And you go, there is totally a world for that to be movement based, because it's all behavior. And all the major difference is the frame. And it's about like going, how do you create that illusion of spontaneity? Well, there's numerous takes. So there's a whole, and then there's the whole world of intimacy direction, which obviously is becoming so like huge in terms of looking after actors and making sure that it's safe. So I think there's a kind of a whole world that I think is blossoming about.
Yeah.
That I'm definitely not finished with. I'm kind of like, I need to do more.
Yeah. It's crazy to me that how long has there been a fight director?
Yeah,
and yet
of course.
now is the time. Like in the last 5 years, we've started seeing intimacy directors, but like these scenes are so intricate and
they're so like
delicate,
like and delicate and I suppose it came out of like things that shouldn't have been happening, and the idea of like, let's improvise that moment of intimacy. And you kind of go like, but you wouldn't improvise if that was like if that was a stabbing. You go, there's no way you'd dream of going, oh, well, we just like see if it works out.
No, exactly.
So like,
leave the actors to it.
Yeah, they figure it out. And you just go like, thankfully now there is a language around it, and people like, you know, while they're training, there's a whole thing that people like have the language and the capacity to be able to go, actually, this is what I need for me to do that scene. And I go, that's absolutely necessary. And anything that empowers the actors to actually have more like agency and power is a good thing. And I say that as a director. Genuinely, I think it's really crucial.
Yeah.
Because they are the ones that are doing it. And I think you have to be able to kind of provide conditions that people can feel safe, feel comfortable, and yes, do incredible artistic work, but the working conditions have to be like absolutely good, so people want to do their best work and can do their best work. And the world of intimacy, I think, is so necessary.
How do you, day one, what are your
How do you begin?
Yeah, how do you begin?
Always physically. And I suppose that goes back to that kind of, the whole philosophy of Fragments was the antithesis of table work. It was this visceral kind of, I wanted to make theatre for people who didn't like theatre. Do you know what I mean? Because I come from a working class background. The world that I grew up in was like, you know, all my friends were musicians and techies. There wasn't anyone who lived in the kind of world of theatre. It was kind of alien to me. So I was like, if I could make work for those people, the people that kind of go, they'd rather go to a rave or they'd rather go to a gig, or do you know what I was like? It was much more. It was a very visceral, physical experience I wanted in the audience. I didn't want them to sit passively. I wanted them to be on the edge of their seats, to be like elated and like have a totally different experience. So that's always my route in. So it's always like there's no tables. It's getting up. It's physically moving. It's trying to build kind of connections and to try and bring actors to a place where they feel really free. And that's kind of the root of it, is trying to create that space where people can be really bold and adventurous and quite wild. Like there's no doubt about it. That's the kind of work that I'm still, when I'm devising, I'm like, I want it to feel like extraordinary. Do you know what I mean? I want it to feel like elated, and I want to go absolutely to a place I didn't think I could experience emotionally, because otherwise I don't care. Do you know what I mean? It's really like, it's really quite visceral. I think that's the best way to describe it.
So you mentioned Grotowski.
Yeah.
We were talking before. I did physical training as part of my degree.
Yeah, in Singapore.
In Singapore. So is Grotowski sort of one of your main influences, or do you have a lot of different?
I did a lot of Grotowski work when I was an actor in Dublin, and I absolutely loved it. Now I kind of go, oh God, do I need to do this for 12 hours?
Well,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I nearly
died
doing tiger rolls. I think it
do you know what I
was.
mean?
Like I was just like, oh, I'm gonna be sick.
And part of my kind of thing with not philosophy, it was like a lack of knowing. Was I thought if I just make them really tired, they'll be brilliant. And that's kind of a lot of the Fragments work was like that. There was we worked on The Master and Margarita, which was this incredible novel that again was researched in Moscow. We went there. There was a kind of a whole thing that happened with that part of the world. But there's a thing called the Devil's Ball, which is where these creatures, historical creatures, come from the underworld and meet the devil and Margarita in this kind of ritualistic thing that happens. I can't remember how often it happens. But I was like, okay, this is the center of the production. And I would just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it to the point where the actors were like, when do we stop? And I was like, when we get it right. And that was like this kind of obsessive thing of, if we are tired enough, we'll be brilliant. And then since then, I've kind of realized there's so many better ways of working. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you get better at going, actually, I can shortcut that. I can find that through a different means that will still give you the same sensation, but without necessarily doing it for 12 hours. So I think it's inspired by that, but ultimately it's refined now. It's a much more kind of gentle process. I still think sometimes actors get really exhausted, and I'm like, but they love it. And I'm like, well, as long as we're really clear about what the end game is here, what are we like chasing, then I can find ways of doing that in a much more economic way after time.
You're right. I think when we get so tired, we stop thinking.
Yeah, that's it.
Some of the best improv shows I've done is when I've come in just like, I'm gone.
Yeah.
I'm not. How am I going to be? I mean, and that's the thing they say. You don't need to be clever, funny, or any of those things. Yeah. So
just be present.
Just be present. Yeah. And so, how do you use that in the work now?
Now, I suppose I know. So I'll work imagistically. So I'll go, if I'm devising a new piece, like last year, again, talking about the notion of obsession, because I was brought in by the Donmar to make this piece about climate change.
Yes, with young people.
With young people. And obviously you're working in a school, you can't necessarily, you've got limitations of time. And I was going, okay, so how do I win them over like really quickly? And so when I met them first, I was like, they were really like sporadic, and they were 14 and all the stuff that comes with that. Some of them didn't want to be there. Some of them definitely did, but were too cool. And I was going, oh God, how do I get them to get this thing that is really like monumental? So the journey, they went from day one, and it was over like a 10-week period. It was really like quick actually in time. Was like really one of the most kind of fulfilling journeys I've ever had, because they tackled stuff that was really complicated in this really like beautiful, subtle way. And it was all working through images, and it was totally visual. There was like a little bit of text. One of the young people was like a writer, and I was like, okay, great, you're writing all the text. So I would just give her prompts. I would say, okay, so this is the first thing. It's like, what if? And then they were like, enough is enough. And she'd just go away and write it. So I had this kind of story of how like we look at community in a different way. And so it started with them on stage, and this young boy has these like bags
Okay.
of like, and he's just swinging them. So it was like, and he was incredible. And he was one of the children that they were like, look, he really needs a lot of attention. But I was like, we just need to find the way. So he really connected with the work. And so it started with them. He basically trashed the place. This is in the Donmar. And I remember talking to the like comedy stage manager. She was like, can I just check, Shane, everything's okay here? I was like, it's really well rehearsed, but we are going to create a lot of rubbish at the beginning. But I was like, it'll all be clean, it'll all be washed. It was like, we'll take all the boxes. And then gradually, all the kind of the rest of the company started to go in and tidy up the rubbish. So at the end, there's this beautiful pile of like kind of recycled rubbish at the very center. And this little kid who kind of became this kind of healer, she was like tiny. She was 13, but looked like 7.
Right.
I was like, great, she's perfect. And she just came in and she held him. And it was just like, it was so powerful. So it was, it was like sponsored by PwC. So there was a lot of like really influential people. There was politicians. And we had the whole place totally enraptured. Because when I started doing the research, I was like, I just feel overwhelmed. I feel absolutely like, how do we begin to even like tell this story? But I'd spend like hours and hours and hours like just digging and like working through music and going, okay, I think the final image is this. So the final image, which is still like my favorite image ever, was they had this, I know the bags came back at the end, and this time they were filled with leaves. And the final image was they kind of collected the leaves together in this beautiful like collection, and they just threw them into the air. So the final image was them covered with leaves. So yeah, it's kind of, then it's back to the idea of what is the image? What's the central like emotional kind of hook for the audience? And how do I do that in a really, sometimes quite manipulative way? Like that was, like, I remember Phil who was the director of participation was like, you're really manipulating us here. And I was like, yeah, I am. Because I was like, that's what I want us to do. I want us to feel something. So we feel something first, then I can go, what do I do? But I was like, if I just go through the mind and through like rationale, I was like, it's not going to work. Because I was like, everyone's tried that. So I was like, we need to try another way into like thinking about like hope. What does imagination do? And how do we go? Our most powerful thing is young people. So I was like, how do we like channel that energy that they have into what could be? So it was really, yeah. So it's still always political for me.
So you found those images via the work that you were doing
totally.
with them, rather than coming in with like,
oh God,
these are the
not at
images
all.
I think.
I go, okay, this is because they didn't really care. Like at the beginning, do you know, genuinely, they were like, what is it? I don't know. Like, should we drive less? I'm like, okay, maybe. And I suppose it was trying to interrogate what it means to them. And then there was this beautiful kind of reflection at the end about what they could do next, which was like, as, you know, as individuals, as like members of their family or as the bigger community. And the kind of where they got to was kind of mind blowing. But I didn't really, that was going to be like a byproduct of the work. I was obsessed with making the work, which was kind of like, and you know, there was a couple of different makers had different ways in, and they were like, no, this is about activism. And I was like, the activism happens after. Let's just make a thing that's really like does the story really well. But I think it can be both. It just depends on the people, ultimately. But yeah, very much devised with them.
And you've run a very successful youth theatre company
in
Ireland for many years.
I ran it from 1998 to 2016, which is 18 years. Yeah. It's called Stagecraft, and it was basically, I did this play in school, and the teacher, who I will always be grateful to, Debbie Swift, was like, you need to do drama. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Do you know what, like genuinely, there isn't, it's bonkers considering like the kind of cultural output of Ireland is enormous. Actually at a local level, sometimes there's very little, especially for young people. And there's a big amateur circuit, but the idea of professional theatre is like, that happens in the Abbey in Dublin, doesn't happen regionally. Okay. And I grew up in a very small town. So Debbie Swift said, you need to go to drama. And I was like, okay, what's that? So I ended up going to Mary Cummins, who was this incredible woman that was, again, ended up being one of my best friends and my teacher. And I was her assistant from I was about I think I started when I was 12, and by a year later, I was kind of assisting her running workshops for younger kids and devising, and mainly musical based. Her big things with musicals. And then at the end, by the time I was like 17, 18, I was like, oh, I really want to be an actor. And she was like, great, because I need to stop doing this and I want you to take over. Wow. And I was just like, but I don't know how. And she was like, you do, because you can. So I kind of totally changed the kind of philosophy of the whole thing. I went off to train as an actor in Dublin, and I was introduced to all these new ways of thinking that for me were kind of like mind-blowing about what education can be and what the place of young people in that kind of story can be. And our first play, which was completely ridiculously ambitious, was called How Quickly We Forget, which was about a group of migrants that came to Dublin in 1998. And I wrote this play, again, which was terrible. Like, do you know what I mean? The writing was awful. And I did it with a bunch of 14-year-olds for one night only. And it was kind of, that was the beginning of like my political voice, I suppose, because I was already going, this is the kind of work I want to do. Nobody wanted to see it, but that was kind of irrelevant at the time.
It's that go and make it and see what happens.
It was that. And when you're 18, you're running a youth theatre and you go, what am I passionate about? And I was like, okay, what happens if somebody's coming to Ireland? Which was like well ahead of the kind of the big wave of terms of like the immigration thing and like the beautiful diversity that now is part of Ireland hadn't really happened. And I was going, so that's what was making me tick when I was 18. And I suppose it still does, whatever, 20 years later.
Yeah.
But yeah, Stagecraft became a kind of a massive part of my life. And I think it's now 27 years running. So 1998, and it's, no, 26. It'll be
You've stepped back.
I've stepped back.
But it is still going.
It's still going. It's run by Jack Reardon, who is now the artistic director, who came up through the youth theatre. Like as a little kid, I remember like shows that he did.
Great.
And again, it was trying to like, I use the kind of work that I was seeing here in terms of the work that we were programming. And I was going, okay, there's this Simon Stevens play that I found. And you kind of go like, and this is in a very small town in Ireland. So and I was obsessed with like, how do we commission plays? Ended up, we founded a studio, which became the rehearsal space. So they were able to rehearse in the place that they performed.
Right.
And a huge outreach program. It was kind of like enormous. And it was built from Mary going, Shane, you're next. And I was like, so for me to hand it over felt like that's how it should be. It was kind of like, Mary kind of gave me this beautiful thing. And I was like, okay, I'm the custodian. Jack, now you're the custodian. And I'm sure in time he will probably, hopefully, maybe hand it on or decide to. So that's something that is kind of, we look after it as opposed to it being ours, which I think is really, I think there's something really beautiful about that idea.
Yeah. I was thinking of, there are directors like Robert Icke. Is that how I say his name?
Robert Icke, yeah.
And who did Sunset Boulevard recently?
Jamie Lloyd. Yeah, I assisted Jamie before he was famous.
Oh,
That's
wow.
one of my claims to fame.
There you go. And so they have such strong signatures to their directing style. Would you say you have a signature style? Yeah,
I suppose it's like, it's always been about like less is more. Like ultimately that's it. Like all of the Fragments work, like we didn't really have a designer. So there was like chairs, like we had like numerous productions with chairs. The Bay had 4 tires. And when I go back to like devising, I'm always going, okay, so what is the least that we need? And go, let's work with that. So it's a really stripped back aesthetic. But then in recent times, I go, like some of the work that I'm thinking about next, I go, oh, I absolutely need to have this from the beginning because that's integral to the storytelling. So I'm now like, next year, hopefully, fingers crossed, I'm going to be doing a show in Amsterdam. And I'm going, that absolutely, for that to work, we're going to be working with a video designer from very early and thinking about like, what's the cinematography of this theatre piece. So that's a very different kind of way of thinking. And I go, that actually now needs a bit more stuff. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the technology and how we integrate that. But I think at its core will still be about the actors in the space. That is the primary, it's always the central thing. And I think that always is the thing that I come back to. The plays that I'm drawn to or the work that I do, I go, but what is the human story at the heart of that? So yeah, I'm an absolute minimalist, but I think that's to do with poverty. Do you know what I mean? We never had any money, so I was like, okay, cool. We can get 3 chairs. That'll work.
Also, I think when you look at theatre, for me,
of course.
the magic of theatre is that if you put actors on a set with nothing on it, people go, well, where are we?
Where are we?
And I don't see any detail, and it looks like a studio, and now I think it's fake.
Yeah.
Whereas if you do it on stage, you can make a world.
Yeah, completely.
Just in the mind of the audience, and I think why are we trying to compete with a medium that can do real?
Yeah, beautifully.
You know what I mean? Like, great,
completely.
go film something.
Yeah.
When we can just use our minds.
Yeah, and I think there's something that's real. And again, it comes back to going, what is it that is the interesting thing? And that is about the transference of energy. And that sounds a bit like, what? But that is ultimately it. You're going, we're in this darkened room with a load of people we don't know, and we have this collective journey, and we go from somewhere here towards the end of it, and we are different, hopefully, if it's good. And that is the magic of it. And that's the thing that we are elusively trying to find all the time. And I don't think you need a lot of like objects to do that. I think you need actors, you need the capacity for imagination, and you need story. And that can be whatever form you want. It can work backwards, it can be non-linear, it can be totally like radical. But ultimately it is about people being in a shared space. It's the shared experience thing. And I'm still excited about that. It doesn't, you know, I still am elusively trying to find the best ways of making that work.
And I think for me also movement can make up that missing sort of element. You know, sometimes when you do see a talking head show, as I've referred to it, and I'm going to stick with that. I saw a show recently where there was the text from this particular. I'm not going to give too much detail.
We're not going to say much.
But the text was screaming at me that there should be like this. You could cut the tension with a knife.
Yeah,
That's what the text was screaming.
Yeah.
And there was nothing in the bodies of the actors.
Yeah.
And you just went, oh God, I just need someone to give me that.
Yeah.
Like
it needs to.
That something in the way they move that means that I could kill you at any minute.
Yeah. It's the kind of. And I think that's, you're working from the text and then going, what is the kind of inner world of that, and how does that translate physically? Because I literally watch stuff sometimes, and another movement director was like, Shane, you're reading their bodies. That's all you're doing. You're just reading their bodies. And I was like, okay. And that was something I had never really discovered, that I was literally just watching their bodies. And the text happens for me, and I can be really like, I can love text and I can love the detail of that and what you can do. But I was like, the thing I'm really interested in is the behavior. It's like, how are they shifting? How are they allowing that to like alter each other? How are they transforming? How are they like allowing themselves to like be open to that thing? And I go, that's the bit I'm like thrilled by.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes, I don't want to say it's missing in British theatre, because it's not, but often it's not the priority. It's the best way to describe it. It's like priority is something else.
And it's so, I mean, they always say the camera doesn't lie, but I think humans can read a lie physically long before they read it in text. You kind of have to be like, he was lying the whole time, or there has to be a slip of the tongue. But you can see in someone's body that they're lying. So, or that these two people have slept together, or that these two people.
The nuance of that, you're like, okay, it's a story.
Yeah, exactly. Just the way they stand by each other, you're like, oh, they have a sexual relationship.
Yeah,
or
and
they
you go,
have.
What is that thing?
What is that?
Happens?
Yeah.
And that could be the most naturalistic piece on earth, but you can unpack that like thing of like proximity, or like how do they like. So it doesn't have to be like a movement section.
No.
Like Jack was saying, Shiny City doesn't need any movement, but it needs a load of gesture, and it needs to be like distilled, coming from that inner life. And I go, that's fascinating. So I think there's some. And again, I'm not totally like excited by it, because I kind of go, there's the other things that like grab me more. But I would love to do like a really heightened naturalistic piece to see if I could handle the stillness of it. Do you know what I mean? I'm really bad at stillness. I tend to go, okay, what happens now if that table, somebody like just runs over it? Do you know what I mean? Like there's like, but then it goes back to that kind of thing of going like, thou shalt not bore. And I go, and that can be really boring when everyone's just running over the table. But there's something about the possibility of disrupting something really naturalistic would be really quite fun. But I haven't done it yet, so that says something. Like, I'm like, well, why have you not actually done it?
No. So you do tend to heighten with movement.
I love it. Yeah, I absolutely love it. Just because I think I think it's the messiness of life. Do you know, there's something about movement that allows the messiness to be like kind of front and center. And I find that's really thrilling when you see that. And it's like, oh God. And I love stuff that's just beautifully aesthetically pleasing. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I saw Complicity did Mnemonic recently at the National, and I had heard about it years ago as being like, it's a legendary piece. And I was like, it's fascinating to look at that. And I've seen so much of their work, and to see those threads of the language physically coming through. And I was sitting beside this lady, and she was like, oh, have you heard of this company? I was like, yeah, I have. They're really special. And she was like, oh, I just went because, you know, the guy was from The Crown. I was like, brilliant. And she was like, and she had this amazing conversation with her at the end about like what it meant to her. And I was like, that's extraordinary, because I'm sitting there with my movement head going on, like, here I am. This is like going to speed me for the next year. And she was just going, this is the guy from The Crown. And it's such a lovely thing that you can have those two people side by side sharing something. And then we had this great chat at the end about like what it meant for her and how I felt. And it was like, because it was lovely, because it was like I was seeing the work then with fresh eyes, as opposed to going, because you see a lot of stuff, you're like, okay, it needs to be really special for me to really get it. But I can be the best audience member or absolutely the worst. I kind of like, there's a massive disparity in my own like reactions.
Someone was saying on the podcast that like they're either jealous or bored.
Bored.
They're like, I want to be doing this. Why am I not making this? Or, oh no, you know. And I was thinking, God, I think yeah,
you feel it, and it's okay. You know what I mean? And you go like, I did this thing in Dublin years ago called The Next Stage, which was in collaboration with the Dublin Theatre Festival and the Abbey, and we got to see all of the international work over like a 3-week period. And we had all these kind of workshops, and we had this one that was about like critical like language. And I would be like, oh, I hated it. And they were like, no, you can't say you hated it. And I was like, but I can. That's like, I hated it. And they were like, what you need to say is it's not to my taste. And I was like, yeah, I hated it because it wasn't to my taste. Yeah. But I was like, every day I make decisions that are kind of like, I either get it or I don't. And I was like, I don't really, I can play the game of going, well, it wasn't to my taste. But I was like, ultimately, it's okay if I hated it because somebody else will love it. So like, that's the kind of thing that you can, in time, you get to realize actually, you don't have to love everything. But I can definitely go, the execution of that was extraordinary. And these are the things that I absolutely go, the craft of that, the rigor of that, I can now pin down. While before I would go, I hate it. And I go, that's really reductive, actually. And I think as you do progress, you get better at actually understanding the bigger things that might be at play in the making of it. And I think that is maturity, if I ever get there. That's kind of like, that's part of it, being able to actually unpack that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were always encouraged to go and see things like everything. And if you hated it, why did you hate it?
Yeah, what was it? Yeah.
What was the thing? And then I guess that's also just going, helps you decide what you want to make.
Yeah,
because if it's not that, what do you want to make?
Is it
and
thing?
Why didn't you like that? And what made you feel? Because sometimes for me, it's like, well done, but I didn't feel anything, you didn't engage me as an audience. And then, so I guess I know if I'm making, I want you to feel welcomed into my game rather than just being like,
I'm over
behind a
But
cross.
it's often too late. By the time you see it, it's too late. So you go like, I've got loads of actor friends, and you know, I used to hate going to see work because I was like, they're going to say, did you like whatever? And I'm going to tell them what I think, but they're rarely at a point where they can do anything about it.
Yeah.
So actually, you're better off to celebrate what it is in a genuine way, because every act of creation, I think, is a miracle. Because when we start from zero, we're always like, we have to go back up the mountain. You know, when I'm rehearsing, I'm often going, okay, I've got to go back up the mountain, because sometimes it feels like that. We've got to go like all the way there again. And it's yesterday we were kind of up there, and now we've got to go back again this Thursday. So I think I've got a lot more, as you kind of see more and as you experience more and as you've made more, you get better at going, everything that somebody does is coming from somewhere. And now I get the nuance of that. And actually, it doesn't have to be a national theatre, whatever quality, it doesn't matter. And some of the most beautiful work I've ever seen has been like made by children. And you go, well, they're not, you know what I mean? They've no aspirations to be professional actors, but it's with such integrity and passion and heart, you go, And I get that as being, that is worth celebrating as well as something that is like technically perfect. I go, actually, it depends entirely on your lens and how am I like engaging with this. But thinking that every actual act of creation is a miracle, I'm convinced of, really helps you go, okay, they tried to do something and therefore that needs to be at least recognized.
Well, and also maybe they're in stage one of something that will
Precisely.
be brilliant
Yeah.
in 5 years.
And who am I to judge? Do you know what I mean? I make
Yeah.
loads of stuff that's terrible. That's called rehearsal. I'm like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, I get it wrong all the time.
Yeah.
And it's hard.
Yeah.
And I think it's, you know, if you use that as going, oh, it's not this, or none of the things I've made would ever have happened if I thought about the things that could go wrong. They just wouldn't. Because if you really do that list, you basically will stay in bed. You'll be like, you know what? It's too much. It's like...
Well, and the judgment, isn't it? And I think every time you make something good, that you part of it is going back in and trying to make something better.
Yeah, and it's the next thing or whatever that might be. And sometimes you do have to go beyond your comfort zone. Do you know, like, there's no point in staying in that place where you're like, oh, I know what this is. And I think that takes courage sometimes to kind of go, okay, actually, what would happen if I did a musical? Or whatever that might be. That would be like the next thing.
So would you say making your own work was how you made connections with people like the National, the Donmar Warehouse?
Yeah, wholeheartedly. Yeah. Because again, like all the Fragments time, I had no interest in the industry. I was just like, I don't care. We're going to do it. And then I kind of got to the end of the Fragment story and I did this tiny little play called 7 Jewish Children by Caryl Churchill in the Arcola. Because I was really, again, impassioned about something that was happening in the world, in Palestine. And I was like, okay, I want to do this thing. And I was in China devising with young people. And I wrote to Carl's agent and I said, can I have the rights, please? Because I was like, nobody's doing anything about this. And they were like, yeah, of course you can. Where are you going to do it? And I was like, oh, I don't know yet. I'll tell you Thursday. And they were a bit like, what is this guy? So then I spoke to Mehmet in the Arcola and I got the studio and I put together a team of actors, rehearsed it in 3 days. And then Caryl came. And so I was sitting in the Arcola doing this Q&A and they were saying, oh, what was the inspiration for the play? And I was kind of going, I know Caryl Churchill's in the audience. I can't possibly answer this question. So Caryl just stood up and said, I think I can answer that one for you. And she's notoriously private.
Right.
So suddenly I had this like the world's greatest playwright and us having this really intense, beautiful dialogue about like what art can mean and how you can protest and how you can think about your place in the world. And then I suddenly started to go like, I should be talking to the industry. And that was kind of like, so Caryl then introduced me to Mel Kenyon, who is like an incredibly established agent. And Mel sat down with me and she was like, well, you keep talking about we, but who are you, Shane? And I was like, oh God. I don't, because all I talked about was Fragments. I was like, we want to do this, we want to do the other. And she was like, but what is the thing that you want to do? And then I started to really think about, I should probably talk to the industry. And then I did a little play at the Finborough, which was really ambitious. It was called the Non-Stop Connolly Show, which was about this Irish socialist, James Connolly. And it was about the Easter Rising. And it was, I think the original was 24 hours long. And we did it over like 4 Sundays. And it was incredible. It was really beautiful. And I was very clever because I staged the first one that the press were coming to. And then I did the rest as rehearsed readings because I was like, it's impossible. So then all the press around it was really positive about this like beautifully staged piece of like political theatre. I was like, it's only the first one. But then I sat down with Neil and I was like, look, now I did the play that was impossible. Can I do a play that's brilliant, please? And he was like, yeah, you can. And then I did a play called Continuity by Jerry Moynihan, which was a one-actor piece about this paramilitary person in Northern Ireland who fell in love and was starting to question his values as this kind of Republican, which was very topical. And then got like kind of extraordinary reviews, ended up being reviewed by the New York Times, and it kind of blew my mind. And I had invited the National Theatre as kind of like, well, maybe it might be good, but can you come maybe and see what you think? And that kind of started that relationship. And then I ended up on the director's course, which is kind of still the most mind-blowing thing that ever happened to me, where they pick 12 people a year. It's invite only. It's kind of like, how do you get on it? I was like, I don't know. And you basically get to meet everybody from producers to directors to people that are involved in dramaturgy at the National, and spend like a 2-week intensive training. And that's kind of started that relationship. And then the rest is history, as they say. It's kind of like it just happens.
Well, I'm afraid our time is running out very quickly. Is there any advice you'd give to someone who's out there thinking about making their own work?
Yeah. I suppose find the way, your way. And I think that could be about going, that supermarket that I pass every Thursday that used to be the clothes shop. I think we could do a piece in there. And actually going, you don't have to think about a building to think about what making something for you could be. And thinking about that audience could be your granny, and it could be your 3 friends that you've got, and actually starting going, that's okay actually. And to think about the scale of that is enough to get it off the ground. And then you can go, actually, next year we're going to do those 3 shops, and there's going to be this pop-up thing that lasts for a week. And then you can gradually grow it. But actually, there's nothing wrong with starting really, really tiny and going, it's me and this room and the audience are 2 people. That's okay. So don't be afraid of small steps. There you go.
Thank you so much,
My
Shane.
pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Make It Work podcast. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our podcast. You can also support us by buying us a coffee. Until next time, keep making it work.